Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine, and today we are going to be discussing changes in religious practices, specifically among millennials. My guest is Tara Isabella Burton. She is the author of Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, available now from Public Affairs Press and soon to be released in paperback. Tara, hello. It is nice to be with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I'm a longtime reader, and it's a delight to finally talk.
Well, this book is completely fascinating. It's very provocative at times, and let's start with the fact that I think a lot of people know that religious belief, institutional religious practice among millennials and among the Zoomers is on the decline. This is a point that has been raised both by the religious right, by the Jerry Falwells of the world, and in triumphantly by the Sam Harrises and the secularists of the world. And so we all kind of have a sense that, yes, the young people, they're not that into Christianity anymore. But what you point out in this book is that it's easy to assume that because that is the case, we have a generation of purely secular people rising up, and that religion is on the decline. But the interesting point that your book begins with is that is not necessarily so, because we shouldn't confuse the decline in institutionalized formal religion for a decline in religion as a whole, because when you look at it closely, and when you actually start talking to people, it turns out that there are some, well, as the title indicates, some strange rites on the rise.
Yeah, so I think that there's this stereotype that I came across often, particularly when I was working as a religion reporter a few years ago for Vox, which is this idea that America is getting less religious, that young people in particular are less religious. And often the statistics that are used to support that are the 24%, give or take, of Americans, 36% of young millennials and Generation Z that say they're religiously unaffiliated. But looking a little more closely, just because they're unaffiliated, as it were, that they don't tick the box of a particular religious identity, does not mean they are not religious. In fact, something like, I want to say, is it 70-something% say they believe in some sort of higher power, 17% say they believe in the Judeo-Christian God. So what are we left with? I do think that there's been an absolute transformation in the American particular religious landscape, but it is not a narrative of secularization. Rather, it's a narrative of moving away from institutional religion, organized religion, and also kind of understandings of religion as something that is, let's say, fundamentally communal in nature, perhaps fundamentally binding of the self in certain ways. And we're moving rather towards a culture of perhaps remixing, reworking different religious, spiritual, communal trends that involve, let's say, whether it's yoga or tarot or wellness culture even more broadly, or, fandom. There are ways in which spiritual and communal experiences are reimagined, as things you can mix or and match sort of according to your own intuition, that religion is designed to serve your internal spiritual life, and that it need not look like any one organized and or institutional phenomenon. So it's a shift, but it's not a secularization shift, but more towards individualism and intuitionalism.
There's something that sounds rather lovely when you first describe the ability to remix religions. When you say, you don't have to subscribe to all of these dogmas. In fact, you literally describe accounts of people who say, well, I'm a bit of this, I'm a bit of this, I've taken some beliefs from over here, I wear the bracelet from over here. And there's something that when you describe that sounds rather nice. You say, wow, everyone can have, you use the word bespoke. You say, you bespoke spiritual practices. And that sounds, that sounds like a positive development. On the other hand, there is something a little concerning about one of the trends you describe, because you say, as you just mentioned, there is a certain individualism to it. There is a certain way in which religious practices are changing where I'm just going to try and not phrase this in a way that sounds insulting to the people who believe in them, where you keep the superstition, but you lose the community aspect in some ways, in some of these. I mean, you're describing lots of different tendencies. Some of them obviously do have community aspects. But yeah, the hyper-individualism and there's a very capitalistic development where people are sort of buying spiritual practices, and you're losing a lot of the things that were almost kind of beautiful about religion.
Yes. I mean, I think that I share your wariness. I think there's one particular group of people for whom this is sort of much more distinctly or obviously a positive trend. And that's people who experience themselves to be marginalized from or not welcome in traditional religious communities. I'm thinking, for example, of queer Americans who make up about 48% of them are religiously unaffiliated, so almost double the national average. So for people who have not experienced welcome in an organized religious community or who don't feel at home there, this may well be that the goods do outweigh the bads. But I think overall, there is a real trend in seeing, or downstream of seeing religion as something that you can mix or match, or perhaps upstream of it, is this notion that religion becomes a kind of means to an end, where the end is a certain kind of best life. Your skin looks great and you're self-actualized, and it's hyper-individualistic and kind of very embedded within sort of capitalistic notions of success, both sort of in more explicit ways, I'm living my best life, and that includes having a sort of great job, or less obvious ways in terms of, I take time for myself, but the way in which I think of this time for myself is always in dialogue with the time, sort of the work day. It's the 1 hour SoulCycle lunch break. I won't say necessarily the danger, but that's certainly where one might make the case that what is religion without any metaphysical truth claims, if it is just about a kind of self-care or a psychological sense of well-being that's also tied into certain notions of success and routine, what even is it?
I think you take great care in this book, I noticed all the way through, of trying to withhold normative judgment as best as possible. Although you do at one point use the word charlatans to describe some of, again, not all of. I mean, you talk about a lot of very, very diverse different practices. You talk about everything from Harry Potter fandom to social justice activism to lots of different ways in which people find meaning. But you do, when you talk about charlatans, you do talk about people who essentially profit off of and prey on people's desire to find some kind of meaningful practice in their lives. But first, before I get to that, I have to ask you, what is soul? I don't know anything about SoulCycle. What the hell is SoulCycle? I really don't. I've heard of this thing. What is it? What do people do? Why is it religious?
Quick fire, right, left. Here we go. Right, left, right.
How is it different than a regular workout? It's different for so many reasons, but also different in like a mental, spiritual way. So I feel like a lot of instructors will touch on that. I know it can be intimidating. I know I was scared like going into it, and people say things like, oh, it's a cult, or like if you're not in shape, like you can't come. Like it's literally the most like welcoming, like non-judgmental experience you will see.
Do you know what spin class is? Let's start there.
I know what a spin class is.
Okay. Imagine a spin class taught by Ayn Rand with candles.
You mean hell? Just imagine hell.
I mean, this is paraphrasing because I now don't have my notes to hand, but I remember coming in with my first ever SoulCycle class, and I was sort of like semi doing this for journalism and semi doing this because, exercise is good, right? And I come in and this woman's just like, focus on yourself, nobody else. It's okay to be selfish. Other people drag you down. I know, like the candles are lit underneath her sort of throne cycle.
So, you guys, I think it's time for all of us to take a moment and pray. Oh my God. Sorry,
But there is a real, I think, vibe in wellness culture more broadly that a certain kind of selfishness is necessary because the world, including other people, want things from you or get in the way of your authentic self. That whatever divine goal is out there for you is so individualistic that like almost the number one thing between you and this divine self-actualization is society itself. And that is really implicit through so much. I mean, we talk about these strange rites as a multiple phenomena, but I think something that really unites them is this implicit metaphysic, which has a long history in the American religious tradition, in transcendentalism and in New Thought, of this idea that sort of there's a pure energy that you can connect with, which is your inner divinity, and society is getting in the way. And that's, I think, if there is a metaphysical assumption, it's that.
Yeah. There's that phrase that you quote, which is something like, real care for others begins with self-care. And I've heard that before, and I thought, does it? I mean, I guess technically, because you do have to put your oxygen mask on if you're going to put someone else's oxygen mask on as well. But also, there's a certain point at which you have to get to the caring about others. I think that of the day, I mean, I am not a particular fan of the old time religion, but yeah, one of the things that you do seem to point to is that what we're losing is not, in fact, again, to use a pejorative term, the woo, or the, the supernatural or the superstitious. What we're losing is the church, or is the community, or the sense of a general community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right, certainly, that and although it's certainly also true of particularly in an era where we can church shop, I'm not sure there's that much difference between, let's say, the affinity group of a Anglo-Catholic church in New York and the affinity group of people who go to Catland, the New Age / sort of a witchy store in Brooklyn. But that said, I think that what we do lose is a sense that largely, and I think like there are exceptions, actually, I think the sort of language of privilege and problem in social justice discourse is one place where like this gets restored in a slightly different way. But the idea that our desires, our innate selves, are not always good. What we want is sometimes bad for us. And what we are authentically is not simply reducible to a set of desires which are good and a set of restrictions upon us from without which are bad. And I think that's what I'm wary of, as it's where I think that these become a kind of, capitalism sneaks in everywhere, but particularly the second that you basically define the most authentic human being as a set of desires. And of course, all of those desires are pure and authentic and not remotely mediated, but socially, or so the narrative goes. Then you start getting really close to kind of worshiping avarice, even, to use a loaded word.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because it does seem like a lot of the practices and beliefs that you identify do emphasize this authenticity of the things that you want and you desire and that fulfill you, without having the inconvenience or bother of having to conform to any dogmas like thou shalt not. And as you mention, one of the problems with something like that is that there are, because we do live in a capitalist society, there are large forces that shape our desires. It is not the case that our consumer preferences spring naturally from the essence of our deep soul, that it was created somewhere else. That we are shaped and molded by forces beyond our control. And I think you do talk a lot about the way that people are made to believe that subscribing. I mean, obviously, naturally, Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop comes up in the book, but so various companies that exist to try and sell the prospect of spiritual fulfillment.
I mean, what's so fascinating is the way in which that spiritual and or moral fulfillment, because have become sort of what sex and riches were to advertising, however many decades ago. I think of something like in the 50s, Elizabeth Arden's Red Door Spa was marketed as this kind of exclusive place where you wanted to look like one of the upper class women of New York City. And that's very much the advertising. A few years ago, although they've since closed during the pandemic, they rebranded to be Mind, MYND. Self-care, you can truly say, is mine.
But it's the true beauty within each of us, that internal spark that defines one's attitude, confidence, and soul that we seek to amplify. It gives us purpose, a mindfulness, a conscious worldview that guides the choices we make. We don't believe that taking care of oneself is an indulgence. It's a lifestyle.
Think about the razor commercials, and I'm going to say it wrong, so I always forget if it's Gillette or Gillette.
Gillette, the best a man can get.
You buy this razor and you're a sexy He-Man and all the women are going to want you. And these ads change to sort of images of social justice, a man teaching his trans son how to shave for the first time, or otherwise teaching certain sort of values of masculinity. And it was rebranded as the best a man can be. And like, on the one hand, it is good that we are sort of culturally, morally hungry, that this desire is we tapped. Like, that is great. I'm glad that we are a morally hungry.
Now we have inclusive razor companies. That's better than non-inclusive razor companies, I guess.
But at the same time, the idea that like, how do these desires get fulfilled? There are lots of corporations who are making money off the illusion of fulfilling those desires. So it becomes very much about how we feel in our mode of response. Like, I am watching this ad and it makes me feel good. And, I know kind of logically that I'm not necessarily supporting a certain cause by buying this razor, but I'm going to like and share, and maybe I'll get a little bit of social capital by sharing it, which is going to sort of give them some more clicks. And it becomes this sort of odd relationship between my self-presentation and self-commodification as a kind of moral person and my social media avatar thereof, my desire to feel good about myself. Someone else is making money, and kind of what has really happened, but a kind of signaling to moral ideals without very much action or consideration. And that's the point. I think those are the people I'm most willing to call charlatans, are those corporations or those bigger organizations that are able to and end up taking these images of whether it's political resistance or spiritual fulfillment and just turning them into products. Like Sephora, for a while, sold an introductory witchcraft kit, and it did get taken off the shelves, not because of the outcry of conservative Christians, but rather actually the objections of various witches, various backgrounds, who found it sort of offensive in various ways and belittling. But they tried to sell a what was it, $42 witch kit or what have you, and that's sort of the new normal, I would say.
Hi guys, good morning. If you are new to my channel, I talk about witchcraft, paganism, and tarot. And I'm probably going to piss off a lot of other witches out there, because I think we all need to be a bit honest with ourselves when it comes to our own personal paths. Would I have been super excited about a witchcraft starter kit at Sephora at 13? Hell yes, I would have bought it.
Many of the developments that you describe are somewhat neutral, or at least debatable in their social impact. I mean, one of the things that you point out is that we consider religion, when we hear the word religion, often to be organized belief in a deity, and that's not necessarily how we should think about it. We should think about it more in the sense that sociologists have thought about it, which is how the different ways that people find meaningful narratives, find purpose. You'd say that these four qualities: meaning, purpose, community, and ritual, and that in many ways we are just seeing a transformation of what people find those things in, and some of it just seems a curiosity more than anything. Some of it's just fascinating, just like an interesting sociological observation rather than a warning that civilization is in decline.
I don't know. I mean, I do think, obviously, a lot of the groups I talk about in this book are at the extreme end of things, which is to say, not every sort of left-leaning feminist under the age of 35 has dabbled in witchcraft, say. Although, even before sort of the age of Trump, where witchcraft had a renaissance, it is true that like neo-paganism was actually technically among the fastest growing traditions in America. So
that is by the way, that is not a thing that I knew about until reading your book, is that under Trump, witchcraft had a renaissance. That is a...
Oh, yeah. The magic resistance, it was a thing. I mean, I feel like it's had its day now, but I think that the what I would defend is not that like we are all going to become polyamorous transhumanist witches, but rather that those of us, particularly, and I think the millennial cutoff is a vital one, because those of us who sort of grew up with the internet as a just normal part of our social lives, and the Zoomers, God knows what the Zoomers are doing. But I think that there's a sense in which the way in which that we relate to one another and to media and to text and to ideas is very much downstream of being used to interacting because of the internet with information in a way where we claim, demand a certain kind of ownership. What we surround ourselves with, the kind of information we interact with, the way we think about it, is always secondary to, we think ourselves as people who ought to have a certain kind of agency. This is why I open with the discussion of fandom, and particularly Harry Potter fandom and fan fiction. The idea that like, this book it didn't end the right way and we can reimagine it. And this being just kind of normal in fan culture, but also more broadly in our media interactions. I think that specific phenomenon, the idea that information, text, stories, narratives should serve us, whether you blame capitalism, whether you blame the American religious landscape and like the legacy of New Thought, whether you blame Harry Potter fan fiction specifically, I think that is much, much truer than any one iteration thereof.
Yeah, I'm certainly deeply concerned by all kinds of hyper-individualism that sneak Ayn Rand's philosophies, that smuggle them in under the guise of spiritual fulfillment. Certainly. But a lot of things you open by talking about what sounds to me just like a wonderful experience, which is this event thing. I don't even know. What do you even call the Sleep No More? Is it a play?
They don't like the term immersive theater, but sort of, I guess, site-specific, promenade, semi-interactive, 6 stories wandering through, professional experience, kind of erotic. It's weird, man.
Tell me if I have got this correct as to what this is. This is a fake hotel built in a series of warehouses in New York, where a 3-hour sort of production of Macbeth or a production inspired by Macbeth is put on, where you, the visitor to the play Macbeth, because you're not quite an audience member, you're more sort of visiting the play, which takes place over the course of many rooms, and you're wearing a mask, and as you say, there's a weird sexual aspect. I mean, you went to this thing. Well, the way you described it made me want to try it, but that's the sort of thing that, it's this kind of transcendent experience, or it takes you places, and that just sounded great. Give me that over the Southern Baptist Church any day.
I mean, it was pretty awesome. I went 13 times. I was a hardcore fan back in the day. It was not cheap. And I know people have been like 200, 300, 400 times.
Okay, all right. That's a little much.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. But I'm torn because, and I think Strange Rites overall was written from the perspective of someone like, I do not despise the whole modern world. I loved Sleep No More. I tried, at some point, certainly in my 20s, most of the communities, though certainly not all. most of the communities that I describe. I was a hardcore wellness junkie for a while. I had my witch years, and I don't think that it's all bad, and I don't certainly mean to write against it. But I do think, particularly with something like Sleep No More, this production, something that I found so fascinating is that, for me, it really was a spiritual experience at the time. It's one of the many things that ultimately sort of got me back on the path to organized religion. And it was precisely this recognition that like there was a real hunger for transcendence that I had and didn't, I was a theologian and yet academically I was doing my PhD or my DPhil at the time, but I had no idea until I walked into that space just what I was hungry for. And yet at the same time, I think that the experience there is something about it costs $100. It's really expensive. And who is profiting from it? Yes, the performers, but they're not exactly paid as well as they should be. And it also becomes this kind of very particular erotic experience where, you are having a very beautiful, professionally muscular person who is half naked, whisper in your ear and kiss your neck. And, what is that doing in that context? And money is changing hands, and you're also posting, the selfie of yourself in the mask, and what is that doing? And there's ways in which I think the production, one of the things that makes it so good is that it taps into a real hunger for experiential transcendence.
Far from what is usually expected of a theatrical performance, this curious piece of theatre keeps the crowds anxious up to the very end, and most of those who survive it find it an experience for life.
And one of the things that complicates my relationship to it now is the realization that there's a gap in the market it's very aware of, where a lot of different phenomena come together.
And you do point out that particular performance may be really, really quite cool, but there are a lot of now these sort of rises of the paid experience and the paid Instagrammable experience that are a little more discomforting or a little stranger or cheaper. I mean,
you go to have an experience, capital A, capital E.
Yeah.
And I think it is true that particularly after the popularity of Sleep No More in New York, the idea of the experience, whether it's that weird line between the immersive theater production as a kind of attempt to do something interesting artistically with theater and the professional experience that exists, for people to take Instagram photos with. I mean, the rise of the Instagram background that is designed for your photos at museums and other cultural events is really striking to me. Things are designed to offer a certain kind of transcendence or vision in a way that is ultimately about marketing the fantasy of transformation.
Can I ask you something that has been on my mind for ages and that really eats at me, and that I think you are one of the only people who might have the answer to? Okay, all these people in our generation who believe in astrology and stuff and witches and whatever, how serious is the belief that it is true? Because I talk to a lot of people, who will casually mention astrology, or they'll say, because I'm a Gemini or whatever. And what I can't tell is if it's meant seriously or not. And I have this strange sense that it is neither meant seriously nor not seriously. That almost the question of its empirical truth is irrelevant. And I wonder, when you talk about, people who practice, the people who are trying to hex Brett Kavanaugh, for instance, which I think is hilarious. I think, you should hex Brett Kavanaugh. I thought that was delightful in a certain way. But then I wondered, well, do you think you are actually hexing Brett Kavanaugh? Is this a ritualistic thing that you are developing? And so you've studied all these people who believe in these things. Is there, to what extent are these real strong beliefs about, metaphysical beliefs about the way the world works?
I'd say, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 7. And here's what I mean by that. I'd say that probably when it comes to something like astrology, it is as much a spread as you'd have of like how many Christians believe in the literal resurrection. Like you've got your Christians who are like, Jesus was like a pretty cool guy, and then they were like, yeah, he did some miracles, like that coming back from the dead stuff, weird. You know, there's a range. But I think that my relatively informed guess here would be that if you asked your average person who's spiritual but not religious, or even actually a lot of people who might tick the religion box, what do you actually think spiritually, metaphysically is true about the world? You will get an answer that is something like, there's like a force, there's some energy that governs everything that like is within us that we can tap into, and we are sort of looking inward is probably the best way to get there. But you can, by focusing your inner attention in some way, possibly have some kind of outcome in the world, whether it's sort of magical per se or just in the low-key spiritual direction. And I think someone who, let's say, is hexing Brett Kavanaugh might say something like, I do not think that I am personally causing Brett Kavanaugh's head to explode. However, by like the collective effervescence of our efforts, we're all going to be inspired to, you know, do more activist work, and also the energy in the world is going to be directed in a certain way, and we're directing that energy towards him, and then maybe things won't go well for him in some way. And it's not quite as strict as like, we are causing his head to explode, but there is a belief that energy is malleable and that focusing personal thoughts and efforts can affect that sort of vibe out there in the universe. And I think that's pretty, like, I'd say that, you know, lots of self-proclaimed Christians or Jews or, you know, might also say the same thing, even if they, like, tick the box in the forum that says, you know, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, and, you know, whole Nicene Creed thing. And that's something that I think is perhaps distinctly American, although I think we've probably exported it by now. But I do think, going back to my belief that the history of the 19th century self-help craze known as New Thought is like the key to all of this, that's, you know, from, let's say, the 1860s onwards, that idea that the inner animating force of life is something that we can harness through our thoughts has been an increasingly central part of American life, and not just in the sort of secular or non-religious sphere. Even things like the prosperity gospel in evangelical circles, I would argue, very much came out of this notion. So I think to that extent, people believe in energy and synchronicity. Do people actually believe this star means this will happen for me? Maybe not exactly, but I do think that there is some fundamental assent to some proposition at the bottom of it.
So a lot of this stuff, I think to myself, well, the degree to which I'm concerned about this depends on the degree to which you are serious about it. And that is true with like the Harry Potter fandom. You discuss, what are they, Snape wives?
Snape wives, yeah.
What is a Snape wife again? Someone who...
I mean, it was a very sort of distinct phenomenon in like Harry Potter fandom, where a group of people who were probably not trolling, and I think it was LiveJournal, got just really into writing Severus Snape fanfiction to the point where they thought Severus Snape was talking to them and married to them or romantically involved with them on the astral plane.
If you weren't dating Snape, which Harry Potter character would you date? Now, you're saying if you weren't dating Snape. I don't ever think that could be possible. In every world, I'm always dating Snape. So let's just say if I was cheating on Snape, because I'd always be with him, I'll just be cheating. Draco, Malfoy, cardboard, cut out.
And again, how literal was it? How much, you know, was it just kind of a fun, slightly erotic way to fantasize in community about a character? Probably, again, something in the middle. It was, the character of Severus Snape, was a vehicle for certain kind of ideas and excitements and a way for a community to come together. Do I think your average Harry Potter fan thought Severus Snape was talking to them? No. But did your average Harry Potter fans feel a certain degree of ownership over the characters as a result of the fan community that allowed them to see the characters as theirs rather than that of J.K. Rowling's? Absolutely. And I think that's something that's been borne out in like the afterlife of the Harry Potter fandom, particularly after J.K. Rowling has been increasingly unpopular among her longtime fans. There really is a sense that like these characters, Hogwarts, are ours and not hers. So yeah, I think this is the same, something in the middle.
Let me ask you a critical question. You discuss in this book wellness culture, occultism, techno-utopianism. You talk about some of these weirdo reactionaries on the right. You talk about social justice activism. And I think it is very analytically interesting to conceptualize these things as religious in nature, to take that meaning, purpose, community, and ritual framework and think about, well, to what extent are these drawing from or mimicking or giving us the same things in our lives as traditional religions did. Do you think, however, the category of religion ends up being so broad as to be meaningless in the sociological and anthropological conception? I mean, when I was seeing that, meaning, purpose, community, ritual, I started to think, well, does that mean that everyone, no matter what, ends up being religious, regardless of whether they're what they're, and well, the reactionaries have a religion, but like anti-racism, that's a religion too, and everything's.
Yes, I would defend the framework with the caveat that I think this is true in sort of study of religions, sort of discourse more broadly, that you really can't pin down. There's as many definitions of religion as there are scholars of religion, and I think. Certainly where I think it's useful is to say, like, what are your governing assumptions about the way the world works? What is the sort of hermeneutical framework within which you and your community, conceived broadly or narrowly, sort of engage with, self over here, form the world? I do think it's almost impossible to sort of separate religion from culture in that way. And I if the criticism were to be launched that one is equating religion and culture, my response to it to be say, yes, that's right. You really can't distinguish the two. Any attempt to kind of codify certain elements of sort of what is important about the world, how should we live in it with one another, and what are we doing here? All of our, I would argue, and this is perhaps betraying my own hand here, that like all of who we are as human beings is kind of working out the answer to that question. That's sort of what kind of beings we are, is even our telos, one might say. And so obviously I do come to the question with a certain bias, but I also, there's almost no definition of religion that is narrower, that would not already kind of exclude more than you'd want to exclude.
Yes, although if it did have, I think as a leftist and an atheist, there is part of me whose first instinct is to say, well, I'm not religious, right? I am distinctly non-religious because I don't believe in anything supernatural. I'm a materialist or whatever. And there is a definition that you could posit that says that, if you reject a deity, you are non-religious. But the expansive definition does suggest that, and in fact, you explicitly cite certain types of social justice activism as having elements of religion. So it definitely means that you don't have to you don't have to be a theist, an explicit theist to be religious. Is that correct?
I would say so, yes. I think the way that I would frame it sort of broadly would be, what is your conception of the good? What is the conception of what binds, where are you bound? Where are you free? Not to suddenly get all existentialist in here, but I think that sense of that interaction between expansive notions of freedom and where freedom is good and where you see limits as placed rightly or wrongly, where should we be free that we are not, where should we be bound that we are not, that I think one vision of religion comes into view.
I do think one way in which it is useful to expand the definition of religion beyond the explicit belief in deities, is that there are kinds of secular ideologies that take on many, many important religious dimensions. One of the categories, communities of people that you profile in this book, that I'm very glad you profiled in this book because they drive me up the wall, is the rationalist community, or what they call themselves, the rationalist community. And one of the things that you point out, and that I think is absolutely true, is that many of these rationalists, the people who are most convinced that they have escaped a lot of aspects of religious belief, have in some ways replicated it. And the most amusing example of that to me is always what is called the simulation hypothesis that is offered by people like Elon Musk, self-proclaimed rationalists who say, oh, we're living in a simulation. And I always think, well, when you get down to it, what does that amount to saying? Well, they say, oh, well, the world was created by an intelligent creator. It's just like you've just rephrased classic religious belief in a new language, which is the language of scientific rationalism.
I do believe our reality is simulated. We find math and geometry throughout the cosmos. We didn't invent mathematics and geometry. We interpreted what we found, and we used that information to make symbols and language to describe what we found in the system, but the system was here before we crawled out of the oceans. We're headed towards simulating future artificially intelligent digital beings.
Yes, I think they're a particularly salient example in my mind. I also find them fascinating, not least because I find the sort of whole broader techno-utopian culture fascinating. But I do think that they may, in some sense, while being relatively small in number compared to the other groups I talk about towards the end of the book, certain elements of their optimism, I think, have certainly suffused through our sort of wider technological worship into the broader culture.
Well, I just want to conclude here by pointing out first that you say in your conclusion that we don't actually live in a godless world, or I guess even an increasingly godless world. We live in an anti-institutional world where the proliferation of internet, creative culture, and consumer capitalism have rendered us all simultaneously parishioner, high priest, and deity. America is not secular, but simply spiritually self-focused, which is one of your core points. And I think that is, in many ways, when you phrase it that way, it sounds troubling. But as I've mentioned, you are sort of careful to withhold very severe judgment most of the way through. And in the last page of your book, you say, we're waiting to see which of these will win the techno-utopian dream of a world in which we're optimally efficient machines, and social justice utopia, or a vision, the atavist vision of a purifying catechism will bring us beyond the tyranny of civilization altogether. But I want to ask you to maybe give me what this is a work of social criticism. Clearly, you see you're disturbed by certain elements of this. I mean, what do you see is valuable in the transformations that have occurred, and what would you hope that we would, I don't want to say like what is a socially healthy form of religious practice, but I mean, it's clear that you're not particularly anti-religious. Is the dream that we return to more institutionalized forms of spirituality? Is it just that we get away from the profit motive? Is it that, we do need to see the more social justice people win out over the real horrible reactionaries, but it's okay to have all of these religious practices? Is it just the kind of inward lookingness that is discomforting? Yeah, maybe you could comment on what your hope would be.
So I think that sort of I do see the decline of institutional religion as a sort of failure of institutions. I mean, I think that, and I say this as a practicing Christian, that, many churches have sort of so squandered the trust and goodwill of their members that, I don't know how you get back to any form of sort of public trust in the institution. saying sort of nothing of the faith itself. I think that ways in which those institutions are held accountable is sort of, it's definitely on the good side of my mental check column. At my most optimistic, or let's say when I'm feeling optimistic, what I hope and imagine might happen is a kind of revival of smaller scale communitarianism, where the chosen family, the friend group, the community that becomes stronger through certain kinds of necessity might see a revival. And I think the pandemic is one of the few sort of opportunities for potentially positive growth I've seen during the pandemic, as a sort of, whether it's the fetishizing of cottagecore or what have you, there is, I think, a renewed interest in like, how do we live communally and well, and how do we live perhaps on a smaller, more intimate scale. And, I'm certainly not the only person I know that has this sort of fantasy, the commune fantasy in the post-COVID age. I don't know how broadly that can scale. I don't think we're going to see like a massive resurgence of like Zoomer Christians really into the Latin Mass. Although, you never know.
That actually, as you were saying it, it sounded really plausible.
I mean, I did once write a piece about, I do think there actually is a like subculture of that. There's certainly subculture, like trad to own the normies vibe. And there's like a good version of that and a like really shitty version of that, to editorialize for a moment. But I do think that I think a sort of renewed hunger for communal life, and particularly a life outside of the ways it's been commodified, is that hunger could well be fulfilled by institutions this generation will build. That's like my most cautiously optimistic way of framing.
See, I thought I was asking you a stupid question, but sometimes you ask a question you think is stupid, and then you get a really inspiring answer. Tara Isabella Burton, the book is Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. It is out from Public Affairs Press.
Thank you so much for your time.